I began to say that I had, listening to the lectures and discussions of the last day and today, I've obviously begun to rethink what would be the most pertinent issues, how I'd like to present the controversy between Buber and Scholem. And so I have some preliminary comments. One in particular emerged from the last lecture regarding Troeltsch and his understanding of the mystical and its relationship to institutional religion. I think there's another dimension to the discussion, at least as it appertains to the Jewish engagement, the German Jewish engagement in these issues. And that has to do with what we may call a post-Kantian epistemological dilemma. And let me just explain that very briefly, and it will re-emerge or resurface in our discussion. As you know, Kant suggested our knowledge of is ultimately limited to what we experience from the concrete world. And he deliberately used the word Erfahrung, as opposed to something we will come back to later as Erlebnis. Erfahrung was confined in Kantian discourse to the world that we perceive through our five senses. And he also made a provision. Perhaps it's something deeper, and he called it the world in itself. Now, philosophers debate whether he meant that just methodologically or as a way of suggesting that we really can't go beyond in any plausible way. Oh, don't do that. You may restore the noise.
Yeah, no, it's like, first it's a bit more like
quiet,
okay. And I think that
no, fine, don't worry.
Just make your voice louder.
Okay. Okay. Now, can you hear me now? I can speak a little closer to the mic. All right? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah. I think you'll just have all to be like really, really quiet.
Okay. I do speak softly. I'm sorry. In any event. And of course, Kant let the Kantian understanding of our sources of knowledge, of the that which we can call knowledge as opposed to opinions of irrational emotions and the like, lent itself to the birth of and giving energy to what we now call positivism, science, technology, how to understand the natural world in all its dimensions, not only in terms of objects, but also the way we organize ourselves politically. So we have an emergence of a political science, economic science, and the like, but all guided by this epistemological modesty, if you wish, of the Kantian tradition. But that left us with the question, can we have ultimate knowledge beyond things, beyond the everyday? And Kant left, at least as we heard, some of us heard him, the possibility of a knowledge beyond that, the limitations of the Erfahrungswelt, the world of ordinary experience, a world that we can all understand through relationships of time and space, cause and the like, and lend itself to the burgeoning of what we might call scientism. But it left us adrift regarding knowledge beyond. And of course, there's often, you know this better than I do, Kant was accused of destroying, killing, eliminating metaphysical possibilities and knowledge. And that sets us up for a discussion of how we get beyond the limitations of the Erfahrungswelt. Now Buber, Martin Buber, at the time he was only known as the grandson of a man named Shlomo Buber, or Solomon Buber, but we're speaking about, was a great scholar of Midrash, of rabbinic literature, but we're speaking about Martin Buber, of course. I'll just give you some, you probably know this as well. He was born in Vienna in 1876 and raised after the divorce of his parents, raised in eastern parts of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, in a city called Lemberg or Lvov. Today is part of the Ukraine, but it was a great center of traditional Jewish life, and he was raised in an Orthodox home. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But when he came to the university, particularly the university here in Berlin, he studied with two prominent figures who began to question the epistemological limitations of the Kantian legacy. And that was Wilhelm Dilthey, and you probably know the name, and Georg Simmel. And Buber became their disciples. In fact, at the very end of his life, he died in Jerusalem in 1965 at the age of 87. His last breath was, "My teacher, Dilthey." Beholden to Dilthey all along the way. And of course, I just want to repeat it so we become clear when I read and get mumbled up in all sorts of references. Dilthey coined the term Geisteswissenschaften as opposed to Naturwissenschaften. And Geisteswissenschaften addresses the world beyond the epistemological Erfahrungswelt. As I tell my students a little bit, in perhaps a paternalistic way, when someone cries, you don't just measure the chemical qualities of or constitution of the tears, but you, according to Dilthey, you nachleben. You try to identify and re-experience, if you wish, the experience that brought that person to cry. This is essential to, according to Dilthey, to the Geisteswissenschaften. It's a different methodology and a different presuppositions, how we come to know, this use more contemporary language, the other, another human being, another culture. We can't just simply remain on the surface and decode what we hear or see, but we have to learn to feel the other. And this appealed to Buber. And it lent itself also, Dilthey's, what we now call Lebensphilosophie, a philosophy of life, but the word is on Leben, or the emphasis is on Leben, to new ways of thinking about religion and mysticism. And that was Buber's concern. Buber very early began to employ the methods and presuppositions of Dilthey to explore mysticism, not only Jewish. One of his great books, great in the sense of his reception, was called Ecstatic Confessions. It was published by Dieterich's Verlag in I mentioned it yesterday, in 1907, quite early, and had a major impact on German expressionism. Someone did one of these boring, at least my point of view, dissertations on Robert Musil, who quotes 276 times Buber's Ecstatic Confession. Imagine a student do that in an age without computers. You have to go through it. He deserves our admiration for his diligence in industry. Today with a computer, you can do it very quickly, obviously, but that was significant. And Buber Ecstatic Confessions had a great impact on German literary expressionism. And in that collection, he brings Ecstatic Confessions, what he called Ecstatic Confessions. I'll come back to how he understood that in a moment. All these are preliminary comments to what I really wanted to tell you, or I was prepared to tell you. He brings Christian mystical witnesses, particularly of women. One of the first to really acknowledge female mystics within the Christian tradition, both Eastern and Western, that is to say, Catholic, Protestant, and Eastern Orthodoxy. But he also brought pagan confessions, Islamic confessions, and surprisingly, not one Jewish ecstatic confession. At the time, he wasn't aware, and I'll indicate that's why that's significant for the story. His own philosophy, which I devoted to my dissertation, largely written here in Berlin, and I was, so to speak, adopted by Jakob Taubes, which did influence me somehow. But in any event, though, that I probably shouldn't admit to, but nonetheless, was on Buber's, what I refer to in my dissertation as a Erlebnis Mystik, a mysticism based on Erlebnis. And eventually withdrew from that or modified that, but in that period, he introduced, in addition to Ecstatic Confessions, the mystical wisdom, as we refer to it, or the spiritual wisdom of the Hasidim. The Hasidim, of course, we all picture them with long beards and fur hats and the like. And we assume when we get to Jerusalem or see pictures, these are the authentic Jews. but they're a modern phenomenon. They emerged in the 18th century, and in many ways as a way of resisting their understanding of the modern world. And I'll say something more about them perhaps in the discussion. But Hasidim, not what we call tradition, but it's a modern tradition, and a very unique approach to mysticism, which I'll speak about momentarily. I'd like also to signal that Buber and Scholem, their exchange within a Zionist discourse. When I say Zionist discourse, please do not associate that with Netanyahu or even Ben-Gurion. The Zionist discourse in Germany in the 1910s and the 20s was part of what they call the post-assimilation Jewish quest or dilemma or predicament. After having gone through the purgatory of secularization, attempts to adapt to a modern world, the bourgeois world, and bourgeois ambition, a younger generation, often led by Buber, because he was a bit older than Scholem by 20 years, was concerned of tapping anew features of Judaism that will allow for a spiritual and cultural and meaningful, engaging experience. They could not go back to traditional Judaism. They found it difficult. Some did, but certainly Buber and also Rosenzweig and Scholem could not quite get back. But they were looking for alternative sources other than what they understood to be rabbinic orthodoxy to draw upon for a spiritual and culturally and philosophically meaningful Jewish spiritual identity. I'll try to elaborate that a bit later, but that was part of the discourse. Both Buber and Scholem turned to what we may call the mystical tradition, but not in the way we've so far heard it in terms of the Protestant understanding of mysticism, but largely influenced by the post-Kantian epistemological concerns and the question whether we can re-tap the mystical experience through Nachleben. And that will be the heart of the controversy between Buber and Scholem. Both were, in a sense, anarchists. That is to say, not uncertain how to proceed, not able to accept the authority of tradition in the way we would understand it institutionally. Gershom Scholem always said, I'm an anarchist, but I'm very different than you, Buber, because I'm looking forward to a new revelation. And here he's quite fundamental. You may find it peculiar, at least I do, I have to admit, maybe you wouldn't. He said, if there's going to be a new revelation, how would you know it? And he said, well, hear it. God will speak to us anew. And whether he meant that ironically or not, but apparently he meant it seriously, waiting for a breakthrough from the transcendent. Buber was not prepared in that respect. Well, without elaborating, Buber's anarchism was much more theologically anchored than and grounded than Scholem's. But one more comment, and you'll forgive me for blabbering if you wish. The Jewish mystical tradition that influences the discourse on Hasidism, this 18th century popular mystical movement which emerged in Eastern Europe and very quickly gathered around its teachings, its hundreds of thousands of Jews, hundreds of thousands, a mass movement, popular mysticism. And I'll have to come back to that term, popular mysticism. But it was influenced by a form of mysticism that we call Kabbalah. And Kabbalah doesn't have its, at least as I understand it, its point of departure in a mystical experience or a quest for a mystical experience. It was largely, using a technical term, theosophic. Theosophic, fancy word, explores the nature of God's inner life, sometimes we call it the Godhead. But I think much more fundamental, God as a personal being. And here I think at least my students, both in Israel, less so in Israel than certainly in Chicago, have difficulty understanding a personal God. But the Bible speaks about God having an independent will. He speaks to us, or she speaks to us, has anger, it punishes us. I remember years, forgive me for blabbering, but I remember years ago I put together with a very dear colleague a handbook on Jewish theological concepts, but viewed from a contemporary perspective. And we gathered 110 different scholars to talk about different concepts, mercy, charity, and the like. But we've had great difficulty finding someone to speak about a fundamental biblical notion of reward and punishment. God rewards and punishes us. God judges us. And that's a personal God. The only person I was able to find, interestingly, prepared to speak about God as in terms of reward and punishment was a Hasidic Jew, a Hungarian Jew who came to the United States to collect money for his community, a small, relatively small Hasidic community of 10,000. He left behind his wife and 8 children, and he was slated to be the follower of his father, who was the master of the community, just using term, a crude term, the guru of the Hasidic community. Each community, Hasidic community, and there are many, has at its center a mystical master called a tzaddik, a righteous one. I'll talk about his role. Any event, this man, Rabbi Rothenberg, couldn't go back home because the war broke out. His wife and 8 children were annihilated in Auschwitz. His parents and the community. He had no community left. All the Hasidic community, all the members of his father's community, including his wife and 8 children, were decimated. For him, as a believing Jew, reward and punishment was a very poignant question, the existential religious question. He wasn't a scholar, but he came to me, and I promised to reformulate what he had to say in academic prose, which was, of course, a violation. But we speak about a personal God. In many ways, as I understand the Kabbalistic tradition, it's an attempt to rescue a concept of a personal God. A God who's said to love us, care about us. And we often experience the world, certainly, what seems to be the absence of a caring, loving God. Kabbalah says, the premise of Kabbalah is to penetrate the secret life of God, so we understand God's personhood in a way which will allow us to continue to affirm God. And affirm God not only as a personal God, but the God of creation. God created the world, behold, it is good, and then we're told in the book of Genesis, very good. But come off it, as what Americans say. Is it very good? It's not even often good. Certainly, Rabbi Rothenberg would have difficulty saying the world is good. And yet, he would not relinquish his belief, his faith in a personal God. That is the project, as I understand it, of the theosophical tradition of Kabbalah. It's primarily not concerned with the mystical tradition, as was delineated in our previous discussions, although it's there as well, but understanding how we can understand God's mystical, or mysterious, forgive the word mystical, mysterious presence in our lives. And they come to the conclusion, and I'm speaking, of course, in broad terms, that we have a relationship to God that we have to honor, that we are ultimately partners with God in the work of creation. And if we understand God's inner life, we could somehow work upon God such that he, she, the Kabbalists actually often say she, which puts them in the right camp in terms of contemporary discourse. But actually God for the Kabbalists is an androgynous, a little bit of male, a little female, but that's also all right, so to speak. Any event, and as it spins out, I assume you know this was from out before. There are various dimensions of the dynamic life of God, and we can, through particularly our ritual life, as Jews at least, other human beings perhaps more through ethical action, but the wisdom of the Torah is the granting of the law, 613 mitzvot, commandments, which according to Jewish tradition correspond to every aspect of our bodies, all our organs and emotions and the like, which means it's comprehensive. All features of our life are to be devoted to service to God. For the Kabbalists, it is how we can help God give fuller expression to his life in the world of creation. And they developed methods, and I'll just say very briefly because it's going to be muffled in my written presentation. When you observe the dietary laws, you just don't say a prayer and then you avoid eating pork or whatever and milk but you focus your prayer on with very finely formulated contemplative intentions, how to direct your prayer to features of God. Historians of religion will say this is theurgy. Theurgy means that you can do acts that affect the Godhead, that affect God's will, if you wish, God's presence. There is clearly a theurgic aspect to, if you accept the term, to how we direct our religious life to helping God, or not helping God, inducing God to have a fuller expression in our lives. In a word, Kabbalah is concerned with the rescue, to use a fancy term, revalorization, give a new energy, new significance to God's personhood, to rescue our understanding of God as who cares about us, who loves us, who is a part of our lives, in ways sometimes we don't fully understand. And that's the background of that I like to explore with you with respect to Hasidism. Buber-Scholem once referred, and this is crucial, to Kabbalistic piety as being metapolitical. It's not political in the way we understand it, but it's acting on the process of redemption in a much more effective way than politics could be, with the ambitions of power and the like, or even understanding economic order or whatever. It's where the action is. If you ever come to Jerusalem, and I couldn't invite all of you, but I invite all of you, but separately. I would take you to the ultra-Orthodox quarter of Jerusalem, and you'll see lots of graffiti. Not as you have in the subways of Berlin or the universities, but religious graffiti. And the most prominent one is Zionism equals rebellion. Rebellion against whom? Oh, of course, God. But God's providential presence. Because the Zionists, and even the better willing ones, the more sober ones, which doesn't include Netanyahu, mistake that we can change the world through politics. No, it is through piety, through the Torah. There's 613. They're the real politicians, they would say, of pushing the world to redemption. So you have that strong, if you wish, messianic, redemptive quality. And it's a redemption that is cosmic. It includes all of us, the world. It's less concerned with personal salvation than in individual illumination, individual salvation. It's metapolitics. That worldly politics is a mistaken path that God has given us through the Torah the agency to change the world, to complete the process of creation, that we can truly say the world is good and very good. But that's just an introduction. You'll forgive me if it was all somehow scattered. You know, since we have students from Oxford, it's said that the Archbishop of Canterbury once approached the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, and in an ecumenical spirit he said, "Rabbi, could you kindly suggest for me, for my own education, an introduction to systematic Jewish theology?" And the rabbi said, "Well, Jews don't have a theology, and if we had one, it would not be systematic." Anyway, you forgive me. I have some, being a good boy, I wrote out a lecture, you know, but the debate between Martin Buber and Buber-Scholem on Hasidism reaches back to the early 1920s. Then a neophyte scholar of Jewish mysticism, Scholem cast doubt on the authenticity of Buber's representation of the spiritual universe of Hasidism, a Jewish movement of popular mysticism that arose in 18th century Eastern Europe, a movement which in time had hundreds of thousands of followers. Still in his early 20s, Scholem challenged Buber, 2 decades his senior, to name the sources of the tales and anecdotes he published to depict, to characterize the mystical ethos of Hasidism. Ethos is a key term we'll return to as well. Buber accepted the challenge and published in 1922 a pamphlet with a comprehensive list of the sources of a work on one of the more renowned Hasidic mystical masters. Scholem was not satisfied, however, for he found Buber's work to be tendentious vehicle to advance his philosophy of dialogue. For the most part, Scholem voiced his critique in pinierso, silently, quietly, in correspondence with Buber. In an epistolary exchange of letters in the late 1940s, Buber replied that if Scholem was correct, then his more than 30 years of engagement in Hasidism were in vain, were mistaken. It was only towards the end of Buber's life, he died in Jerusalem at the age of 87 in 1965, that Scholem voiced in print his criticism of Buber's conception of Hasidism. In response, the 85-year-old Buber published on the pages of an American Jewish periodical commentary a defense of his approach to the representation of Hasidism. And that's a text I distributed for our discussion tomorrow. He did so by highlighting the methodological issues attendant to the study of a movement of popular mysticism, which he argued cannot be adequately understood within the framework of the history of the ideas alone. For he held that with Hasidism, formerly esoteric mystical teachings and practices of a religious elite were adapted and thereby adjusted to address the existential reality of the ordinary and, for the most part, uneducated Jews. I've italicized in my text the word understanding, or verstehen in German, for it is a terminus technicus, a technical term which lay at the heart of Buber and Scholem's dispute on radically divergent conceptions of Hasidic mysticism. Hasidic masters celebrated as tzaddikim, righteous. That all has a nuance, but we leave it for the moment. They were the tzaddikim, the masters, and their followers, the Hasidim. Hasidic masters celebrated as tzaddikim took on the use of the coloration of a distinctive ethos. As Buber formulated this claim already in his inaugural study of the movement in 1906, Hasidism is, quote, Kabbalah become ethos. As a movement of popular mysticism, Buber held that Hasidism is characterized by a distinctive religious consciousness determining how one is to engage life in its full sweep, from one's transactions with his fellow human beings or her fellow human beings, to how one buys tomatoes in a market, how one deals with professors at a university, or how professors should deal with their students at a university. That's just an editorial elaboration. Well, you're supposed to be a Dr. Vater, and sometimes we are a bit too autocratic and not so nurturing. But Buber says that we should, at least his understanding of Hasidism, learn to celebrate, to engage in the divine in all our activities. Whether it is Hasidism or not is the dispute. Anyway, I continue. Scholem would agree that Hasidism is primed, energized by mystical ethos beholden to Kabbalistic teachings. But he held that Buber misconstrued the ideational fancy word for ideas and movement of ideas, the ideational dialectic and phenomenological significance of how these teachings were expressed in Hasidic spirituality. Hasidism, as already indicated, is an offshoot of the Kabbalistic school associated with Isaac Luria, who lived in 16th century Palestine. In broad terms, we call it after Isaac Luria, Lurianic Kabbalah, is born of acute Gnostic anxiety that the world is in a fallen state. Yet at the same time, biblical faith instructs one to affirm the existence of a divine affirm existence as a divine blessing. For God created the world, and it is good, indeed very good. So how to adjust a Gnostic sense that the world is fallen, that the created world is corrupt, and there's no release from the corruption that is ingrained in our creaturely life, and yet at the same time affirm the biblical God, the personal God of whom I spoke before, a caring, beneficent God. Luria and his disciples spun a bold theosophic myth to reconcile Gnostic sensibilities with monotheistic theological affirmations. Lurianic Kabbalah projected a dialectical drama whereby in the act of creation, God seemingly explicably lost control, resulting in the incarceration, the imprisonment of divine sparks, divine energy in the corporeal, material world, Kant's Erfahrungswelt, if you wish, depriving the world thereby of the fullness of the blessing of creation. It is divine. It is the divinely appointed task of Israel, the Jewish people, to redeem the sparks from their corporeal, material captivity. They are to do this by performing the mitzvot, the commandments of the Torah, and according to mystical intentions as prescribed by Lurianic teachings. As Scholem noted, the mitzvot thus attained a metapolitical significance to hasten redemption, conceived as the restoration of the divine sparks captive in the material world to God, and allowing her, God, to complete the act of creation and the full realization of his primordial beneficent intent. There was, however, a painful flip side to the redemptive responsibility imposed on the Jews. Should they fail to perform the divine commandments in complete accord with the prescribed mystical intentions, and I mentioned that they were very complicated and demand very intense contemplative engagement, and the agony, if they fail to do this, the agony of divine sparks lost in the material world is deepened. In a word, Lurianic Kabbalah placed an enormous burden on the Jews. Should they fail in their nigh cosmic responsibility, they were haunted by a profound sense of sin, And it's interesting, the Hebrew term for sin, biblical term for sin, is borrowed from archery. If you miss the mark with an arrow, that's the etymology of the word, the sin. So you miss the mark, you got it. You're in trouble, but moreover, the world is in trouble. And it is here that the story of Hasidism begins. The founder of Hasidism, Israel Baal Shem Tov, taught that the arc of service to God and the liberation of the divine sparks need not be confined to the synagogue and Torah study. The ordinary Jew can also participate as effectively as the mystical elite in the process of redemption and in and through the mundane activities with social and economic circumstances demanded of one, especially if you're poor. The Baal Shem's disciples, who each established their own so-called courts to host their followers, the Hasidim, elaborated as he had this message through stories and anecdotes. Buber held that it is through these stories and anecdotes that we gain an understanding, verstehen, of the ethos, the experience animating Hasidism as a movement of popular mysticism. Understanding, therefore, is preeminently a hermeneutic task, which requires an empathetic, truly compassionate identification of the life experience, Erlebnis, which lies behind the given verbal expressions. As a student of Wilhelm Dilthey, whom to the very end of his life, as I previously noted, Buber proudly referred to as my teacher, Buber claimed that through an attentive listening to these expressions, one can relive the life experience as related in the stories and anecdotes and retold over generations by the Hasidim. It is precisely this hermeneutic procedure which Scholem found methodologically dubious, problematic. An exchange with the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, which took place in Jerusalem in 1974, Scholem claimed that the hermeneutics of Nachleben, this reliving, this presumed reliving of the experience of another, necessarily entails a projection of one's own experience. In a discussion following a lecture by Paul Ricoeur on the transmission of tradition, Scholem questioned whether, and I'm quoting from a transcript, it's not printed, but a transcript of the stenographer recording of the lecture, takes as it does its point of departure, as was for Ricoeur, from one's own experience. And then he says, turns to Ricoeur, was a very gentle human being. And Scholem was, as we refer to him, as the great Pope of the Hebrew University, a very forceful personality. You wouldn't want to encounter him in any dispute, although he's a very wise and thoughtful man, but I identify with Paul Ricoeur as a gentle Huguenot from France. I knew both, but I tried to avoid Scholem. But in any event, that's what Scholem said to him. His understanding in the way Dilthey uses this term, not something intrinsically impossible. And if it is done in a merely illusionary way. Can there be such a thing as my power to transfer myself into a foreign, as he puts it, psychic life? My question would thus be, is this possible at all? Speaking, if we take the definition of the history of ideas as the reconstruction of experience by by somebody who cannot do what Dilthey asked us to do. So this is the horn of the problem. A historian of ideas, Scholem insisted, has no choice but to limit and restrict his historical reconstruction of experience to analysis of texts. Hasidic masters of Tzaddikim published a veritable library of philosophic works, disquisitions, if you wish, which in many respects are elaborations of Luriana Kabbalah. What distinguishes these writings, however, are two overarching themes, according to Scholem, undoubtedly, and he's correct when you just focus our work on the written texts, what we refer to as the theoretical writings of Hasidism. No stories, no anecdotes, but a philosophical, if you wish, exploration of the divine life, hidden to us, of course. First, techniques how to achieve and sustain what is called devekut, a communion with God, but a communion of a very special sort. And second, how to control, and this is the very heart of Hasidism, wayward thoughts, strange thoughts, that deflect one from one's consciousness that was considered appropriate to prayer. Myself, I was asked by a budding rabbi from Leipzig, which synagogue do I go to? And I'm embarrassed, I told I don't. Of course, I go to synagogue, I'm thinking about my wife, how long the prayers are. Perhaps I hadn't ate properly, worrying about my students, or worrying how I'm going to prepare a lecture to present to you in Berlin. These thoughts obviously deflect me from my task as a person of piety, of prayer, and they affect everyone, even the more pious. And the Hasidic communities, and there are many, each have their own techniques how to focus and free oneself from these wayward thoughts, which I don't know about Christians, but Jews have lots of thoughts that deflect us, take us away from our prayers. But you need full concentration to get those intentions correct. And some Hasidim clap hands when they pray. Others gesticulate very rapidly. Others have mantras that they sing. There's even a community in Jerusalem where they take little bits of snuff. Put tobacco in your nose. It's sort of like taking, well, why not marijuana or whatever? But they do it to be free of these wayward or strange thoughts, which take you away from. There's one community in Jerusalem which I've studied. Well, Jacob Taubes took me there. They're influenced by Sufism. It's a Hasidic piety that matured in Jerusalem, and very much influenced by Islamic Sufism. The way they dress in Bedouin garments, and they pray in unison, bowing, much of that, almost touching their heads but together. And there's several thousands of them going this very rapidly to flee, to be liberated from this wayward thoughts that take one away from the property of the appropriate mystical consultation to get those intentions correct as they would affect the Godhead. The role of the tzaddik, who is an individual who is graced with a unique aptitude to achieve pristine, pure devekut, positions himself at the center of the community of his Hasidim, to join, and he invites them to join him in prayer, because he has the power, charismatic power, the divine blessing, to lift them up, their prayers, and to lift up with their prayers the divine sparks in which we all are embedded in the material world in which we dwell. Scholem calls this process spiritualization, redeeming the individual Hasid and the divine sparks in which his earthly life is perforce embedded from their bondage to corporeal existence. And in Hasidic theoretical literature, this is referred to, I'll use the Hebrew, bitula yesh, which means the annihilation of our earthly existence, of our individual existence, in order to achieve full spiritual harmony with the divine. Scholem claims this is what Hasidism is about, and it really ultimately yields to a certain Gnostic understanding. What happens to creation after the bitul hayesh, the annihilation of the self? And he's uncertain. You'll see how he deals with it. Buber comes to a very opposite conclusion by virtue of his hermeneutic reconstruction of the experience of the Hasid as refracted in the stories and anecdotes related by the tzaddikim and retold over the generations. Much of it, just for emphasis, is oral literature, not written. It's told from one generation to the other. Buber and the Nobel laureate Shai Agnon, before he became a Nobel laureate and was living in Germany, in Bad Homburg, outside of Frankfurt, they embarked on a project together, which they called in Latin Corpus Hasidicum, just gathering the stories that they knew from their youth. And as they gathered these stories, for instance, Agnon would write a little postcard. Modern, they would say, they were Purdue. And much of their correspondence was either in Hebrew or Yiddish. I heard a story I have to share with you. A wonderful story, but oral. Scholem said, how can you possibly give any methodological, if you wish, epistemological validity to stories? Moreover, he felt that Buber selected the stories that he wanted to hear, and what Agnon wanted to hear. Unfortunately, there was a fire in Agnon's home in Bad Homburg, and much of the manuscript went up in flames, and the project was never continued, at least together. But it's oral literature. Some of it, of course, made its way into written literature, but scattered. I'll return to that in a moment, but it's important that it's oral, primary oral literature. And as you know, oral literature is, as you tell one to the other, expands, gains on different nuance, given the voice of the person who articulates the story. So all this rendered that material problematic in the eyes of Scholem. But there's probably something deeper. Anyway, let's go back to the written text. Buber comes to a very opposite conclusion by virtue of his hermeneutic reconstruction of the experience, Erlebnis, of the Hasid as reflected in the stories and anecdotes related to the tzaddikim and retold from one generation to the other. It is not spiritualization and detachment from corporeal bodily existence that is the essential experience for the Hasid, but rather it is a joyful sanctification of the quotidian, figme, everyday, fancy word, everyday existence. The stories and anecdotes of the tzaddikim serve to teach the Hasidim that God can be met in all spheres of life. Hence, not only is there a need to negate material existence, bittul hayesh in Kabbalistic parlance. On the contrary, since divine sparks are suffused in all of our temporal existence, all of natural existence, even the seemingly most profane manifestations of life ought to be celebrated as God's presence in the created order. I'll give you one example which I like. I'm telling you more about myself than I should, but one Hasidic master says, if you see a beautiful woman, don't flee. Take her as an exemplification of creation, of divine gift, which sanctions my own, waywardness. I'm married for almost 50 years, 2 children, 4 grandchildren, but I still liked to behold a beautiful woman. And then if I was a Hasid, I'd say, fine, God, thank you. The divine spark is eminently present in a beautiful woman, but all aspects of life. I meant that, of course, as an anecdote, which we like to tell. You can say about a handsome man if you wish. In any event, if you'll forgive me for the profanity, if you see that as a profanity. Buber understands Hasidism as pointing to a basic existential truth. Their quote, real faith means holding ourselves open to the unconditional mystery which we encounter in every sphere of our life and which cannot be compared to any formula. Comprised, cannot be articulated in any formula. Real faith means the ability to endure life in the face of this mystery. Endure life even though we often experience it as harsh and brutal, disappointing. As edifying and as inspiring As this message may be, Scholem argues that it is not in accord with the mystical literature of Hasidism, the mystical philosophical literature of Hasidism. And moreover, Buber reads into the message of Hasidism, his own independently developed philosophy of dialogue. Indeed, the quote I just cited is drawn from an essay in which Buber presents his own credo. If we follow Scholem and conclude that the stories and anecdotes of the tzaddikim do not lend themselves to a consistent and coherent reconstruction of the mystical experience of the Hasidim, we are still left with the question posed by Buber, namely, how we are to understand and interpret the rich narrative teachings of the Hasidic masters. I have a coda, sort of, in order to conclude. It was mentioned several times that Scholem there's an autobiographical dimension of Scholem's engagement in the study of mysticism. I'd like to return to that, not necessarily indicating that this is a way to understand the dispute between them, but perhaps just to highlight what was at stake in their dispute. Both Buber and Scholem were avid readers of Kafka. As you surely know, that Scholem conducted a very vibrant, ramified correspondence with his dear friend, Walter Benjamin, on how to read Kafka. And Scholem loved to write poems, so did Buber. I guess it was a typical German convention that you write poetry, good poetry, bad poetry, but every German intellectual is proud to write poetry. I used to, I'm not a native German speaker, but to improve my German in this neighborhood where Chavia is a neighborhood in Jerusalem where was a concentration of German Jewish refugees and Austrian, well, German speaking. And I would visit elderly Germans, speakers, and well, obviously to gain personal contact with the witness of the Weimar period. And anytime I visited one of these German intellectuals, and even more simple, I have a poem to read for you. Anyway, Scholem of poetry. After having had a discussion or a correspondence with Benjamin, he wrote a poem that he shared with Benjamin, and was now only recently published, with a copy of Kafka's Trial. And he addresses God in this poem. Your trial began on earth. Your trial began on earth. Does it end before your throne? You cannot be defended. No illusion holds true here. Oh, we must live all the same until the court will judge us. Indeed, Kafka represented, for Scholem, with whom he identified, a melancholic vision that has traces of negative theology about God's absence. There's a cosmic Gnostic tinge to Scholem's understanding of our dilemma. Not just a post-Kantian and post-secularization, post-Enlightenment generation. God no longer seems to be accessible, and all we can witness is the world's injustice and suffering. But Buber had a different take. He also read Kafka very intensely. And he says, for Buber, and using the Hebrew term, we have the Bible, Hebrew Bible, we speak about Hester Panim, God covering his face. And Buber says, this Kafka understood it. God is hiding, but doesn't mean he's absent. He's just hiding. And he quotes what he regarded as summation of Kafka's position and his own. Kafka wrote somewhere an aphorism: test yourself on humanity. It makes the doubter doubt and the believer believe. And in that spirit, Buber, in his translation of the Hebrew Bible together with Franz Rosenzweig, came to his favorite psalm, Psalm 73, which in Hebrew, for those who know Hebrew, Ani tamid imcha, I am always with you. But in his translation in German, and you'll appreciate the German better than I, he has, Und doch bleibe ich, und bleibe ich doch stets bei dir. The doch signifies nonetheless. That's Buber's, how would you say, very telling intervention or addition to the psalm. What is significant about Buber is on his tombstone when he died, when he's buried in Jerusalem, he simply has the Hebrew, Ani tamid imcha. If he had it in German, he would say, ich bleibe doch bei dir, stets bei dir. The doch captures a refusal, which he famously shared with Kafka, not to yield to despair, to continue to uphold the possibility of celebrating the world as God's creation. A difficult task indeed. It had ramifications regarding how Buber and Scholem understood the project of Jewish spiritual renewal in the auspices of what we call cultural Zionism. I probably warn your patience, Finn, and so I beg your forgiveness. You know, in the Jewish tradition, when you enumerate your sins, and there are many, you pounce on your heart. If I would open my shirt, you would see a deep, deep hole. So, anyway, I'm sorry if I overburdened you. Thank you.